It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the Coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in the control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day, listeners, and welcome once again to the Two Jacks, episode 103, although we lost a couple along the way there, but we are coming to you recording on the 21st of February, year of our Lord 2025, and joining me, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack. G'day, mate, how are you?
I'm good. Who have we got in the green room today, Albo or Dutton?
Yes, we'll get to that. There's a bit of a podcast mania going on with our political leaders in order to soften their images, in order to better communicate their policies and their personalities to audiences that might not always be looking at news. So this was a bit of an issue for Donald Trump. Got around to do Joe Rogan and those sorts of things, and getting into an audience that might not otherwise have cared about him a lot, and was said to contribute significantly to his youth vote, if you like. So these sorts of things are going on at the moment. I think Elbo's done a few things. We'll get to that. But we do have some polling, a YouGov, a news poll polling coming out. And it certainly is pointing towards a minority government. And the way it is at the moment, I think Newspol's got Labor from memory at 31 primary vote, Coalition at 38. Neither of those figures would be enough to see them being elected in their own right. The Tories tend to look for something in the low 40s, and really Labor needs to be in good shape when they're in the high 30s. But they're languishing a bit at the moment. Jack, where would this put the YouGov and Newspoll combined? Where would that put a seat breakdown in the new federal parliament? Well,
YouGov actually, their polling runs the seats as well. It's a new style of polling that they're experimenting with, and they ended up with about I think 66 for Labor and 72 or 3 for the Coalition. 75 being the magic number.
It would be 76.
75 is the halfway mark. 76 is the magic number, and
you've got to have a speaker, and there'll be 151 sitting. So
yeah, and Dutton jumped out and immediately said, well, if they got that close, he thought they could probably get what's called a confidence and supply agreement from some of the independents, and I noticed the ABC was talking to Allegra Spender and I think Zoe Stegel, two of the Teals, about whether they would sign such an agreement, and they kind of hedged, as you'd expect them to. But he would need to get that close before that would happen, and then it would be a question of what advice the Prime Minister gave the Governor-General.
As you've always said, there's a process. The sitting Prime Minister is called upon first to see if he can form a government. So, it is looking more and more like a hung parliament situation. I've got to say, though, Jack, when the YouGov polling came out, one of their spokesmen made these sort of airy statements about where we are in our society and so forth. Why can't polling companies just publish the data and leave the social comment to others, perhaps with more expertise?
Well, I got to tell you, I stop reading when they get onto the other
So do I.
stuff.
I mean, just enough of your bullshit, please. Just publish the data, and if we'll turn to any any number of sociologists that we can call upon for the analysis. So the numbers aren't looking great for Labor. It is, as you would say, if they do get rolled, and Dutton is able to form a minority government, or God forbid, a majority one, Jack, it'd be the first time a first-term government got rolled since, I think, Scullin in the 30s.
Yeah, and Dutton would be the first person to take the job ever as leader of the opposition after an election defeat and win. That's never happened.
Yes, and really one of the things I want to have a look at is the minor parties, Jack, and that's going to be really interesting because how preferences flow is really going to determine the outcome of this election. I mean, that's state of the obvious. You would have seen the Trumpet of Patriots has been launched by Clive Palmer. It's actually the name itself. I've been looking into this. The name itself, Trumpet of Patriots, was arrived at by a former office bearer for the Australian Federation Party, a party that ran a few candidates in South Australia, I think a few in Victoria, a few in Queensland, maybe in New South Wales. And that office bearer kept the name, and then the Australian Federation Party was actually re-registered as the with a name changed as the Trumpet of Patriots, with Clive Palmer now sort of being the chairman of the party. It's the usual old Clive thing, and of course we've got the reforms to the to electoral funding coming through, but they won't be in place for this election. I think they kick in 2028. So this is probably his last hurrah to throw a lot of money around. Didn't do him much good last year. I think Albo used a figure of 100 million. It's probably closer to 120 million for the return of Senator Ralph Babbitt and that alone. But at the same time, the UAP, when Clive was still running that, and they did deregister the party after the 2022 election. But in 2019, Palmer probably contributed to Labor's poor result more than any other minor party.
Yeah. I would say someone's doing some good out of this, whether he's spending 20 or 100 million. Somewhere along the line, someone's clipping the ticket on that as it goes past. You know?
Well, outdoor advertising. They'll have a nice little boon, newspaper advertising. And, of course, we can look forward to the uninvited and often unwelcome text messages. We get those from the major parties too, but Clive helped himself to that in 2022. Didn't do him much good, as I say.
That's one of the good things about being in the 852. With the 852 in front of your phone number, you don't get those.
Yeah, no, you're not going to get them there. But they did come out in a stream in 2022, and of course, I think Labor did that pretty well in 2016 with their Medi Scare campaign, Jack, done by text message on the day of the count. Moving on with the minors, obviously we have the Greens. There are a number of left-wing parties. I tell you what, the Victorian Socialists, Jack, in the Werribee by-election, getting around 7% of the vote. Now, that's, I know it's a by-election, and I know it's a state by-election at that, but you get 7%, you're in the running for a Senate seat.
Yes, quite obviously, yes.
You've also got the legalised cannabis party, Jack, which is, I think... I was talking to someone from the Libertarian Party, and they sort of that's their enemy. That's their enemy on the left, because young people in particular, were going, "Well, I don't know who to vote for." Oh, here's someone from the legalised cannabis party, and tick that box. Legalised cannabis do have two representatives in the upper house in Victoria and one in the upper house in New South Wales. There may be others that I'm not aware of. they're tending to poll around 5 or 6% as well in some of these by-elections. I think they got 5% in the Werribee by-election. On the right, we've got the Trumpet of Patriots. We've got such a weird name. We've got the Libertarian Party, which was the Liberal Democrats, now rebadged as the Libertarian Party. Spoke to their New South Wales people, and they're running a lot of candidates, as many as they can. They don't think they'll get to 151, but they'll be represented pretty widely in the major areas on the eastern seaboard. You've got Pauline Hanson's One Nation, of course, who, according to Newspoll at least, are running at around about 7%. Again, maybe just enough to get a senator up in Queensland. Malcolm Roberts is up for re-election. I doubt whether any of these fellows, or any of these parties, I should say, will return a House of Reps member. There are, of course, a number of independents. We need to think about that. Russell Broadbent, Jack, is running again. I think it's Monash. He was not pre-selected, and he's pretty filthy on the Liberal Party. He's been a member of long standing in the seat which goes from the eastern fringe of Melbourne out to Gippsland. And I reckon he'd be more than half a chance. So I guess where I'm going with this is, how do these preference flows go back? Now, we know that the Greens preference Labor at around about 85%. So, of all the Green votes cast, generally speaking, 85% of them will go back to Labor. So the very close correlation there. You might say the same for Cannabis Party. You might say the same for the Animal Justice Party. You might say the same for the Victorian Socialists. But on the right, it's much more confused. We know that Pauline Hanson's One Nation, for example, they will preference the coalition at around about 65%. That's what's happened in previous elections, with 35% going to Labor. Tells you probably that the One Nation party has got a bit of a sort of working class background. The Libertarians will continue to. They'll preference the coalition higher than they will Labor. But overall, and I think this is one of the big problems for the coalition coming into this election, is that you've got a lot of splintering going on, a lot of minor parties popping up, and the preference flows don't come back to the coalition at the same rate that they do with the Greens and Labor, for example. And that's going to have a really significant. Now, if that changes, then I think Labor is in trouble. But from what we've seen so far in the last 2 or 3 federal elections, the votes just aren't coming back to the coalition. And if they do get 38% of the primary vote and don't get preference flows back, I mean, I can see them getting well beaten. The next question to ask, we'll get to the podcast in just a minute. We may as well start with them now. Albo was on the Batuta Advocates podcast, which has got a pretty strong audience, a pretty good audience. I know the Batuta boys very well. They're Western Queensland boys. They're great fun, actually. But it was a pretty serious interview, and I thought it was really well handled. And the Batuta boys are the ones who came up with the phrase, this is well before the podcast, of Peter Dutton as Timu Trump. And that tag, I think, might just well stick. Very, very clever. I've heard it being used by a number of other journalists. But Timu Trump is a bit of a bit of a tag that might stick. There was a soft interview with Peter Dutton on 60 Minutes last Sunday, and the first question that Stefanovic asked was, are you Australia's Donald Trump? And you could see the unease in Peter Dutton about that, because Trump's about as popular as a syphilis shanker in Australia. And it might be something that the trumpet of patriots might be able to soak up some of that niche, but it is something that Peter Dutton has been very keen to distance himself from, those sorts of parallels.
Yeah. No plus for him in that.
No plus for him whatsoever there. So one of our listeners, Jack Lawrence, has asked, wanted me to put this question to you: is Peter Dutton the Coalition's Bill Shorten? The bloke who looks to be on the verge of something and then will fall flat when the votes are counted.
Yeah, Bill was a bit lucky in the sense that he got Malcolm Turnbull, who called a ridiculously long election campaign and then campaigned very badly, and Bill very nearly got up. And do you remember post the election, Bill went on kind of a victory lap of the country, having not quite won.
He really did get something. What I remember most of all was Turnbull turning up in a ferocious temper at about 1 o'clock in the morning at the Liberal Party gathering there in one of the CBD hotels, and demanding the Australian Federal Police get involved in the Mediscare campaign and all this sort of stuff. I mean, he was dead set rattled. And Shorten had a very good campaign.
He did. When Malcolm turned up, I watched that and thought, well, the toys are well and truly out of the cot, aren't they?
It was a real tantrum, yeah. And then there are a lot of people in the Liberal Party hoping he would fail too, not to the extent perhaps of losing government, but going very close to it, and that's exactly what happened. And then, of course, we get to 2019. Bill Shorten had a raft of economic reforms on the table, which, I mean, I think 2019 is probably marks the last federal election where you've had, particularly in opposition, come up with reform, with economic reforms, because they're just too easy to knock off.
Yeah. So and what happened with Bill Shorten is he joined that long list of people who become opposition leader after a defeat. Even if they do well first up, they don't end up being Prime Minister.
Yeah. And so Lawrence might
could
well be
happen
on the money there.
Could well happen to Dutton again. I mean, when he took the job on post the last election defeat, his job really is to make sure the party survives and make it competitive again. And if you can do better than that, well, that's terrific. But that's probably not going to happen. And he's done his job really well. But that doesn't necessarily give. In fact, history tells us he won't become Prime Minister. So he may well be another Bill Shorten.
A lot of attack ads.
And that's how I still see it. I think he's done a really good job. They'll get very close, but I think there will be a minority Labor government to survive.
I don't watch a lot of free-to-air TV, but I was watching Channel 7's coverage of the cricket in Sri Lanka, and it was just absolutely peppered with attack ads from Labor on Dutton. So they are clearly focusing, and that would be information, data that they've got from focus groups and their own internal polling, saying this is the one we need to attack. And we need to attack Peter Dutton rather than sort of say, well, this is what we've done.
That's a measure of how well he's gone. That he is now the focus of their attacks.
But they obviously see it as a weakness too. So we have seen the podcast. That we say, I think, as I say, wasn't a podcast, but Peter Dutton did do some soft stuff with 60 Minutes. He's been on a few podcasts himself. Elbow was on the Batuta podcast, and Abby Chatfield, who I don't know, has a podcast called It's a Lot, and you know, their numbers, both of those podcasts are really quite substantial. So they are reaching people who, for whatever reason, might be not tuned to mainstream media news and find this is a better way to inform themselves.
Well, we do know the under 30s don't tend to get their news from the conventional media, and they do get it from social media and from podcasts. So it makes a lot of sense. I mean, it wasn't Trump's idea to go on the podcast. I think it was his 19-year-old son's
So
idea.
they say, Jack. Yes, Barron was the one who suggested he pop up on
Whatever his name is. Yeah.
Loathsome Rogan. And of course, there was the story, Jack, that came out from the US presidential election that there was initial favour towards Rogan interviewing Kamala as well. And one of the advisors for Kamala subsequently reported just in the last week or two saying every time we tried to pin him down to a date, it just got even harder for him. It became obvious that he just wasn't going to do it. And he's more than entitled to do that, of course. It's not as if you have equal time on podcasts or anything like that. I actually think Labor are in a pretty strong position. I know that might seem a bit silly when you look at the YouGov stuff. I think it's got their primary vote about 29 and like a news poll 31. I think there's a lot of upside, and in the heat of a campaign will be a very hot campaign. I think Labor might hit the ground running. We had an interest rate drop, Jack. Listening to the market for what it's worth, it doesn't appear that there will be a second one before the next election. I mean, a second one would be a beauty, but this one, just the 0.25 drop, 25% basis point drop, will give people on a mortgage around $600,000 an extra $100, about $130 a month. So that eases the pressure a little bit. I don't know that it's going to be a big boost for the government. What would you think?
No, not a huge boost, but it's something.
Yeah, they can at least point to our policies are starting to work, and here's the things that we did, and this is what they're doing through their ads, and saying, and this bloke Peter Dutton refused to support them all. So we'll see. There's also just recently been a 2-year ban on foreign buyers of Australian housing, Jack, and that will go down reasonably well as well.
Yeah.
Why can't you have these things long term? Why can't you say, all right, you can't be a foreign buyer and buy real estate in Australia?
I don't think they want to do that.
Well, let's examine it, because it would. You end up with an insular market, right? You end up with an insular market, almost a contrived sort of market, and I guess the other question is, why can't people from other parts of the world invest in Australia?
Yes, yeah. If the aim is to depress the value of the housing stock in Australia, don't forget that's not terribly popular. There's a hell of a lot of homeowners in Australia.
Yeah. Look, obviously the beneficiaries of the interest rate drop are going to be those people who've taken out mortgages really in the last 5 years. I know my eldest daughter was jumping up and down, a bit more money in the household budget with the decline, because she took out a mortgage. She's never seen anything more than an interest rate hike when she took out a mortgage to buy a house. So this is her very first interest rate drop. So she was nice and pleased about all of that. All right. Just finally, sorry, you go on.
Before we leave Australia, what's going on in Victoria? The three most senior police have all gone in a few weeks, two in a week. And the state government has announced they're going to get rid of, 3,000 public servants?
Yeah, well, let's deal with the police issue first. There was a vote of no confidence in the Chief Commissioner, Chief Commissioner Patton, and he resigned as a result of that. So that's from the rank and file of the police, and that tells you that there are significant problems. I'm not going to sheet them all home to Patton, but there are significant problems. I'm hearing some figures, Jack, just in terms of how people are having to deal with crime, that, let's say, in the eastern suburbs, this is unconfirmed, you've got basically, you'll have traffic cops, of course, and you will have detectives and other special forces running around. But in terms of general policing, there is just, I believe, in one large area around Knox, which is a substantial part of eastern Melbourne, there is one divvy van for 40,000 people. So you're not going to be in the crime prevention business for a start, and you're going to be responding, but also you'll have to pick and choose on what you're going to respond to. Now, as I say, those figures aren't confirmed to me, and I think that they are maybe a community problem, or community driven stuff, but someone sent me those figures during the week. There are significant problems with policing at the moment in terms of morale, in terms of numbers, and in terms of leadership. You could almost pine for the good old days, except we know how bad VicPol was in the 60s and 70s. They need some major issues. Look, we're not seeing significant rates of crime increase. Well, certainly violent crime. We are seeing a few gangsters getting knocked off every now and then. But generally speaking, we are seeing rises in property crime, Jack. And that a lot of property crime can be driven home to a lack of a police presence, whether they're on foot or driving around in the divvy vans, or just keeping an eye on the community generally.
Yeah. And the 3,000 public servants, it just looks like either their budget figures are worse than they thought they would be, or their focus groups are terrible, or...
And this is how it ends, right? This is how it ends. If it's not industrial relations issues, let's say nurses strikes, teacher strikes, tram driver strikes, Jack. You haven't got enough in the pot to pay people, to pay your public servants, and then you're going to have industrial disputation, which makes the whole state look chaotic. And look, I'm not in a position to say where there's a lot of dead wood in the Victorian public service. But they're obviously making cuts because things, the bottom line looks pretty ordinary. Tim Pallas has gone, of course, retired, and that's also a bit of a sign that things might not be going all that well. Yeah,
as we've lived through, when the end comes, it can come quickly.
I would say more particular than the speed of it is the absolutely unalterable way that it's going to go, and the big problem that the people of Victoria have in their politics is that the other mob are useless. I mean, the Victorian Liberal Party is an absolute shambles, and we saw that in Werribee. We saw that in the Paran by-election, which they managed to scrape home and pick up. But under the circumstances, it should have been a lock. So there's not a lot of faith in them among voters, and the faith that was held in the Labor Party in the Dan Andrews days is well and truly gone. Yeah, I don't know what happens.
In the end, they'll vote them out, rather, even if they lack a bit of faith on the other side.
Yeah. It's almost like a third party needs to, rise through this. The minor parties aren't getting any traction either, or not a lot of traction either. The sort of thing that might have, infect the federal Labor Party in the next election is that a number of safe Labor seats in Victoria, and there are a number of them, there'll be heavy swings against them. I think those things are going to happen. We did hear too that Albo was going to bring Dan Andrews into the fray in the election campaign. I can't see a lot of sense in that, to be honest.
No. He had a lot of support then. I don't know that he will now.
Look, he's a brilliant communicator. That's why he was a good politician, because he was such a good communicator, and particularly around elections. He had that great gift that very few politicians in the scene have. So this is where we are, this is where we need to get to, and this is how we're going to get there. And in the case of his second campaign, it was this is where we are now, and this is how we got to where we are now. These are it sounds very simple, but only some are very good at it, and Andrew certainly was. But he is largely through pandemic management, I think, what benefits he might have to the electorate generally outside of Labor voters. I can't imagine there's too much of that at all. The Bankside nurses, Jack, we just want to follow up on that. We did see a lot of stuff on social media saying that they were entrapped by people of Muslim supporters and so forth. It seems not to be the case. I keep reading that they will be charged any day, and we're still waiting on that. There were a number of arrests made in regard to the graffiti and arson attacks around eastern Sydney. The two guys who were arrested for the arson attack on the synagogue in Newtown have also been charged with graffiti offences around the eastern suburbs. I've looked at those two individuals. I won't say too much more than they both have significant criminal histories, but not of the, shall we say, ethnic violence type. Very strange. I've been looking at their backgrounds and thinking, where does all this come from? They're not of Middle Eastern origin. They are people who have, without wanting to get into it too much, have, as I said, have spent time in prison. They've both been formally charged now, so I shouldn't say too much, Jack. But where's all that stuff coming from? Are they operating under instructions? And I'm speaking generally now in these sort of attacks, or have they just developed some sort of pathological hatred that they act on?
I'd leave that to the police to run a proper investigation.
Well, they've been charged, so it'll be down to the courts to determine. We also found out that the caravan full of explosives, that was basically not a terrorist type event. It was a sort of organised crime thing, and the caravan was left there basically as a bargaining chip to reduce a few sentences on some people, ne'er-do-wells in the Sydney crime scene, Jack. But no charges yet on the synagogue arson attack in Melbourne.
No, and I think we spoke about this last week. There could be good reason for that. It could be becoming part of, for instance, it could be becoming part of a wider investigation, and they don't want to bring charges while they're investigating the wider situation. But we don't know. And
there's a lot of gossip around it. I won't get into that, but yes.
But there will be some disquiet that there have been no charges. You run the risk that people think that you're not taking it seriously enough.
All right, let's
a little bit of police messaging to get out there and saying the investigation's continuing would be a good thing.
Well, I don't have any senior blokes around to make comment, Jack.
No, perhaps that is a problem, but they must have someone left there.
Well, they'll have the police media unit. If you've ever had any contact with the police media unit, Victoria Police, it's actually really difficult at the best of times to get anything out of them, because everything that you want from them in terms of an official statement has to come from senior officers. and that's often difficult to get. So that might be their issue at the moment. We can't do anything more than move on now to the United States. Now you've got a message. You love Joe Rogan, don't you, mate? You actually really like him, and this seems to me one of the least. Joe Rogan's gone on to ask some questions about Congress, about the US Congress and the representatives there and why they make a lot of money more so than their salary. He said, you look at the amount of money.
Can I just add, I've been asking this same question for 10 years.
Oh, well, that's probably why you put it in there. If you make $180,000 a year, have you got a net worth of $30 million? And Joe, in some cases 30. In some cases, 30 is understating it by a factor of 2 or 3. Yeah. But look, let's talk about motives here. And I know this is a topic that you've been asking about a while. So Rogan is a mouthpiece for Musk. There's no doubt about that. Musk, Doge, and Trump. As I said to you, when he was offered the opportunity to have Kamala Harris on the program, didn't happen. So he really has become a mouthpiece for this. And what I see is this basically is Joe Rogan's own contribution to creating a sense of skepticism and a sense that everything's not working. And so the checks and balances, you've got the courts, which Trump and Musk attacked, Musk in particular. So you've got the judiciary, you've got the Congress, the institution the president needs to actually make laws rather than sign edicts. And those really, and besides the media, are the fundamental checks and balances in the system. And I'm looking at America and I find it very hard to explain what's going on other than a fast track to fascism.
Firstly, I don't know what Joe Rogan's motives are, but I have listened to him. I don't think he's anyone's mouthpiece. Firstly, he's not even a conservative. He was supported Bernie Sanders in 2020. He's been around since 2009, I think, when Trump was still a Democrat. So he predates all of those.
Last time I watched Joe Rogan, he was interviewing Mel Gibson. And Mel Gibson, I don't care left or right, doesn't worry me. What Gibson was telling him, look, I've got 4 friends who were stage 4 cancer people who were healed by a combination of ivermectin and a steroid, fenbendazole, I should say. And it was, he was stumbled his way through it just as I did. But the way Gibson did this was, so they were cured. And it's a dreadful, dreadful thing. The way he said it, he stumbled through his answers and so forth. It made him look like he was lying, and he was. And then Joe Rogan said, yeah, I'm hearing a lot about that too. So what I'm saying is Joe Rogan is basically a chaos merchant who believes a lot of conspiracy theories, Jack. But one thing he never attacks is Musk or Trump.
I've not heard him attack those. I've heard a lot of people who he doesn't attack. I quite like his podcast. I don't tend to watch. I haven't watched the whole lot of any of them, but I watch quite a lot of the clips.
3 hours.
And you say 3 hours, and that's my attitude to it too. But I actually think that's the secret sauce he's got, is because if you're a politician or an activist and you go on there and you've got your talking points, these are the things I want to get across about myself while I'm on there as a politician. That doesn't survive 3 hours because you run out of material. In the end, the person is exposed. And that's why his podcasts are successful, in my view.
Yeah, well, it's probably now might be a good time to tell you that he lost the crown in terms of the number of downloads in the United States, continental North America at least. He lost the race for the first time in many years to Midas Touch, which is a Democrat progressive young group podcast. They took over this week. Well, they had a larger number of downloads. But look, before we go on any further about. I mean, look, the thing that bothers me about the idiotic conversation he had with Gibson was that people who listen to it are going to go, well, look, I've just been diagnosed with cancer, or I'm just stage 4 now. I'm going to walk away from therapy that could save my life on the say-so of, and this is working across the United States, not just in Rogan stuff. I will take ivermectin, etc., to cure myself, and it's not going to cure you; it's going to kill you. Then there is no study, and I know a lot of bogus studies around. Not even a bogus study that says ivermectin and pendazolone are going to cure cancer. And that's the problem I have with it, that it becomes an echo chamber of misinformation and disinformation. Clearly what Gibson was saying was a lie. But when we move on, it's sort of second-tier stuff compared to what Donald Trump has said about Ukraine and Zelensky. We might just preface this by saying the Americans gave Zelensky a list of mines that they wanted to exploit, some rare minerals they want to exploit, cadmium, etc., which Ukraine is rich in, and just handed them a list and said, "We'll take that $500 billion worth. You'll get 50%. We'll get 50%." Now, some people might say, well, it'll be good to have US mining companies in the Ukraine because it might deter the Russians from grabbing more territory. So, but Zelensky rejected the offer because it didn't come with any offer of additional security. It was all based on, we've spent all this money on you so far, so this is what you owe us. Diplomacy at extraordinary levels. And then, of course, Donald Trump declared that Zelensky was a failed president. He called him a modestly successful comedian. He entered into a war. He started a war that he could have solved, and that's caused a lot of umbrage around Europe and in the United States. Actually, I saw a retired general who Trump had given the US, I think, the US Congressional Medal to, who came out and said, no. Tony
US
Abbott came out and said it. Peter Dutton came out and said it. Anthony Albanese didn't because, it's complicated. You don't want to raise the ire of this narcissist because he's going to punish you with tariffs or God knows what else.
You're going to have to sit down across the desk with him at some stage, so you don't. Yeah,
if you're a political leader in power, you can't offer a running commentary on this stuff. But I did like what Dutton said, and I did like what Tony Abbott said.
There was a lovely cartoon in the London Telegraph, a bloke called Matt, who writes a little like draws a little like Tanberg. They're not very detailed cartoons. And he's got a young George Washington with an axe in his hand, standing behind a recently felled tree. And his father walks up to him and he says, "Father, I cannot tell a lie. The cherry tree started this."
Yeah. Did you see, including the Red Tops, all of the UK newspapers were particularly scathing of Trump about this. The Daily Mirror was probably the best of them, which had Trump as Putin's little lapdog, little fluffy dog. Clearly, Trump is not popular in Europe, but he actually doubled down again today, Jack. He should have doubled down with more criticism of Zelensky. So what we have is the Russians and the Americans are meeting in Saudi Arabia. Europe not invited. Zelensky and the Ukrainians not invited. And there, from that point on, I mean, we also had Pete Hegseth, drunk or sober, who knows, who who got up and basically gave away key negotiating points, particularly around Ukraine's NATO membership and the Crimea. Just said that was all off the table. It's hard to believe that the Americans are going to negotiate in good faith with the whole point of negotiating with Putin in good faith is he's going to let you down. I mean, this is a guy who kills his critics. He throws them out of windows, helicopter crashes, plane crashes. He's not a reliable human being.
So what is doable?
What's doable? What's doable is you continue the war. You continue the war and you ramp it up, and you ramp it up. Let me ask you.
But what's the aim?
Well, the aim is to push the Russians back to territory before February 24, 2022.
So I'm just going through this slowly. So Crimea's off the agenda.
No. That becomes a bargaining chip. That becomes a bargaining chip. I mean, look.
Well, it's only a bargaining chip.
We can talk about what should happen, but really, the way this is looking more and more is that Europe will have to do the defending because the Americans won't. Unless Zelensky bends over and gives them $500 billion worth of mineral wealth.
Before you get to that point, I think you've got to work out, what are we trying to do? Now, they haven't got to tell us that, but somewhere behind the scenes, someone's going to have to say, well, this is what we can do, this is what we can't do.
Well, at this stage, what they're saying is, and this is, again, one of Heggs' things that Rubio, who seems to be reasonably sensible, has to walk back all the time. And that is that wherever the battle lines are drawn now is the territory that Russia will receive. Right? No Crimea, and Ukraine forbidden for a period of time, significant period of time, possibly forever, from joining NATO. I mean, I just simply ask you, how would you feel if you were living in Estonia? How would you feel if you were living in Latvia or Lithuania? These are NATO countries, by the way.
Yeah, I understand all that, but I think there's got to be some kind of understanding of what are we actually trying to do here?
Crush Putin. That's got to be the aim. I mean,
Okay.
If you bend to him, you'll lose Europe, or a significant part of it. I mean, this guy has made it very, very clear that he wants a return to the old Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So that includes the Baltic states, that includes Czechia, that includes Moldova, that includes Georgia, that includes all of these other Western Eastern European countries.
Well, if that's the aim, I think that needs to be said out loud.
He's not going to say that. I mean, you're negotiating with a guy who thinks he can play Trump on a break. He's probably a little bit scared of Trump in that no one quite knows what Trump's going to do. But so far, Trump's statements have just been appalling about Ukraine. They, on February 24 and in the days following, 2022, their cities were hit with airstrikes. Ballistic missiles, tanks rolled into their streets. Civilians were killed in the tens of thousands. Some of them were massacred. I mean, I just don't see you turn around and say, well, here's your prize. And whether Putin is going to say, well, okay, well, I'm satisfied with that. I don't want to take over the rest of Ukraine, because that was his objective in 2022, in February 2022. He thought it was all going to be over in a week.
I think crushing Putin is a perfectly morally legitimate aim and not a bad one. I just don't think that there is going to be enough support from the Europeans or from the Americans to achieve it.
I know what you're saying, but we've got very good support from the French. We've got very, very good support from the UK. I think Sir Keir Starmer has been very, very resolute. what will need to happen, particularly if the Americans go south on this, go pro-Putin with this, is you'll need a force of around about 150,000 European troops on the ground in Ukraine.
And at the moment they don't
as peacekeepers.
And at the moment they don't exist.
Well, the British Army, I mean, I saw them yesterday. One of their senior officers said, if we're asked to go tonight, we go tonight.
Yeah, and nowhere near those kind of numbers.
150,000?
No.
Well, the UK military, yes, you're right. I mean, they're not going to be the sole contributing factor to that 150,000, let's say, 150,000 troops. Their military, I looked at their numbers, I think it's around about 80,000 in total. That's Army, Navy, Air Force. You're going to need a significant contribution from the Baltic nations. You're going to need a significant contribution from Germany, France, elsewhere. I understand that there are weaknesses there. I mean, you can't imagine the Trump sycophant in Hungary putting troops on the ground in Ukraine.
Well, they've already said no.
Yeah, well, I didn't know that, but it comes as no surprise.
And indeed, the German Chancellor walked out as soon as Keir Starmer said that he would put British troops there. But of course, he mightn't be Chancellor after the weekend anyway. But
there are 150,000 Russian troops in Belarus.
Yeah, I understand
right now. So if you're living in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland. The crisis is existential, and we don't need too many history lessons to find out where this can all lead. And what we've seen, what we know from that history is the worst thing you can do is appease, because that just gives them legitimacy and gives them the ability to say, "Well, I'm going to try one more."
But to do anything about that, you need to have the blood and treasure to spend and the preparedness to do it.
Look, it's tough. I mean, there'll be Keir Starmer if these things do go that way. I mean, ideally, what you want is the Americans contributing to a peacekeeping force, but it doesn't look like that's going to be very likely.
So is it a peacekeeping operation or is it a crush Putin operation?
Well, once we got to a point where the Americans had dropped out, I mean, NATO is virtually dead in the water. When you get to this point, you are going to need a significant number of troops to stop any further incursion from the Russians into Europe. Because I don't think we're going to get anything from the Americans in Europe at all while Trump remains president.
That's possible.
And so Europe has to stand up. It has to come.
This should be possible for the Europeans. Russia's got a smaller GDP than Italy.
I know, and I know. I mean, they're smaller than ours. It might just be a touch higher, but. And these things are difficult. So, Sir Keir Starmer will have to deal with possibly a coffins draped in the Union Jack coming home. And he'll have to say to the people, this is blood that has to be spilt, and there will be more of it. Because the next thing you know, mate, they're rolling into Berlin.
Yeah, I understand that. What I don't understand at the moment is how on earth the Europeans are going to be convinced to do anything about it.
Well, you would have to accept, one thing, that this conflict, the Ukrainians have been incredibly brave and incredibly ingenious about defending their country and making incursions into Russian territory. Warfare has changed dramatically just in the space of this conflict. Where now a $2,000 drone can take out a $10 million tank. So it needs to be. We need significant numbers there. They need to be European numbers. I think NATO is all but dead, but it needs to be replaced by a European-backed military compact that will defend European countries from incursions from places like Russia. I mean, how would the Taiwanese? And in fact, I was reading this morning about how the Taiwanese have greeted Trump's speech, and they're just terrified because they don't think Trump's going to come to their aim. That he's going to push for a deal like he has with the Russians.
I'm not going to go into.
No, I understand.
China.
I understand why, and that's perfectly reasonable. But let's stick with Europe, okay? And if you lived in Estonia right now, you would be wondering when it's going to happen. Not if, but when.
You've made that point, and my query is, at the moment, I don't see that the Europeans are going to do what you think they should do.
Well, they may not, but where that will end is the tanks will roll into Berlin. And you know, it is just that serious. I mean, I've got to ask you, what do you think Trump is up to? I mean, is he just misinformed? I mean, sitting around in his little echo chamber of disinformation?
No idea.
This has changed everything. I mean, people say, "Oh, Trump does good things and Trump does bad things." Foreign policy was always going to be the issue for how his presidency goes, this looks like an absolute disaster in the making. I mean, why on earth would they sit down with the Russians and not the Ukrainians? Why would they not involve Europe?
Don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Well,
sorry, not involving Europe.
Can you just speculate a bit that they're basically establishing the grounds for negotiation, and that will be essentially a forced surrender from Ukraine. They were invaded, civilians slaughtered. Trump talks about millions of people dying. Well, it's not quite as bad as that. And now they're being asked to, well, you know, all that blood that you've lost on the Eastern Front, it's for nothing. All those civilians that have died, all those civilians that have been massacred, nothing will happen.
Yeah, I've got to say, I've always thought that the chances of a pushback, I can't see how they can get Crimea back, and the pushback to the 2022 borders was unlikely. Just because I don't think anyone's prepared to spend the blood and treasure.
Well, then so the Ukrainians would be well within their rights to keep fighting.
Yes.
I mean, certainly if they're not going to be involved in the negotiations, they just keep fighting.
Yep. That's quite possible.
I mean, I know that is very, very possible. I mean, you know, saw a couple of pieces from the front where they're just saying we don't have any confidence in a peace process, so we're just going to keep fighting. Now, then it comes down to a simple matter of resources, and if the Americans aren't going to do it, I mean, it's sort of gangster stuff, mate. It's like, here's a list of all the mines that we're going to exploit or all the minerals that we're going to exploit in Ukraine. And you'll get half of the capital from it, but the half that you're going to give to us comes off your war debt. It is, you know, it's mafioso tactics. I don't know where we go, but we better move on. Well, we're looking. Vice President Vance, we're probably going back a little way, so we might just move on from that. I just wanted to read. This is a speech made, I think, yesterday or possibly on Wednesday, as we record this on the Friday, the 21st of February. A speech from J.B. Pritzker, who is the governor of Illinois, a billionaire himself. and one of the hotel chains, I think, is
He
where
does own a couple of hotels, yes.
he got a few hotels there. I think got more than one or two. J.B. Pritzker, as the Illinois governor, made a speech yesterday, and I thought, well, here's a voice, because I haven't heard a voice from the opposition. I mean, Kamala Harris, God only knows where she is. The Democrats have almost disappeared off the map.
Kamala Harris has just signed with a Hollywood agent.
Oh, for fuck's sake. So, excuse me, listeners, but Jesus Christ. Okay, so J.B. Pritzker is an impressive fellow. He's 60 years of age, which I think is a distinct advantage too. I think a lot of Americans might not like to have too many older men around. Look, this is his speech in part, and I just want to read it. He said, as an American and a Jew, I find it difficult to resolve my feelings around that Supreme Court case. He's actually referring to a case where the Nazis wanted to hold a rally many years ago. It gave rise to the Blues Brothers line, Illinois Nazis. I hate Illinois Nazis, said Elwood Blues. And he's talking about that case. But I'm grateful that the prospect of Nazis marching in the streets spurred survivors and other Skokie residents to act. They joined together to form the Holocaust Memorial Foundation and built the first Illinois Holocaust Museum and a storefront in 1981, a small but unimportant forerunner to the one I helped build 30 years later. I do not invoke the spectre of Nazis lightly, but I know the history intimately and have spent more time than probably anyone in this room with people who survived the Holocaust. Here's what I've learned. The root that tears apart your house's foundations begins as a seed of distrust and hate and blame. The seed that grew into a dictatorship in Europe a lifetime ago didn't arrive overnight. It started with everyday Germans mad about inflation and looking for someone to blame. I'm watching with a foreboding dread what is happening in our country right now. A president who watches a plane go down in the Potomac and suggests without facts or findings that a diversity hire is responsible for the crash. Or the Missouri Attorney General who just sued Starbucks, arguing that consumers pay higher prices for their coffee because the baristas are too female and non-white. Excuse me. The authoritarian playbook is laid bare here. They point to a group of people who don't look like you and tell you to blame them for your problems. I just have one question to ask. What comes next? After we've discriminated against, deported or disparaged all the immigrants and the gay and lesbian and transgender people, the developmentally disabled, the women and the minorities, once we've ostracised our neighbours and betrayed our friends, after that, when the problems we started with are still there, staring us in the face, what comes next? I'll leave it there, but other than to say, he says all the atrocities of human history lurk in the answer to that question. It was an impressive speech, and I don't know what his ambitions are, obviously, but I think they could do a lot worse. The Democrats.
He was mooted as a possible candidate for the Democrat nomination this time around, but there was no primary. He may well be the first Illinois governor for some time not to go to jail, and that partly because he's got his own money and he's not on a grift.
Yeah. He seems a thoroughly decent fellow. I probably need to do a little bit more work in terms of how Illinoisans view him. But I gather he's
well. It's a strange state. It's Chicago and the rest.
Yeah.
So it's
Chicago and basically rural Illinois.
Yeah. It's two states in one. You know that the Skokie case, the American Council for Civil Liberties intervened.
On behalf of the First Amendment.
To ensure that the Illinois Nazis were allowed to do their march. I think almost none of them turned up at any event, but it wasn't that important.
They didn't march in Skokie. They were allowed to march elsewhere.
Somewhere else, perhaps in Chicago. I'm a little bit on the side of the ACLU on this. I think the best thing you can do is to allow people to do this and then answer them.
It's happening in Ohio, Jack. You've got Nazis flying flags, etc. In fact, it was one of those you've come to the wrong neighbourhood type situations when a number of black men accosted them, burnt their flags and gave a bit of a hiding. I completely disagree. We covered this in the last program. You'd never want to normalise that sort of behaviour. But look, going back to the speech, I think that's an impressive thing. I think there'll be people crying out for this, even by the midterms, that there'll be. We've still got this issue. Okay, they're going to make these savage cuts. I mean, I was heard from a Trump voter from Arkansas who's complaining now, and I'm not mocking this person, but they were getting $100 off their energy bill from, and I'm not sure if it was means tested or how it all worked out, but it was a Biden initiative, and they got $100 knocked off their power bill. And I don't know if that's monthly or quarterly or whatever it is, but they're now receiving letters from the energy companies saying you'll need to pay that $100. So in the end, a lot of people are going to say, you said you were going to fix inflation. And inflation's going up at the moment. It's very early days, but inflation's going up. In fact, the Trump response to inflation goes, I've only been in power for 2.5 weeks. Well, it's 3.5, but never mind. Because those things actually require good government. They actually require economic policies that are substantive. If you've got inflation running through your economy and then you give tax cuts, but top-ended down, you're throwing more money into the economy that will just fuel inflation, and the benefits of those tax cuts to the middle class, which might be, let's say, $50 a week, just disappear. And that's when people are going to get angry. All right, moving on. Margaret Brennan, who's a CBS presenter, isn't she, Jack? US CBS or CBS network in the US. What did she do?
Oh, this is, but we haven't got to cover this. This is about the JD Vance speech. She was interviewing Marco Rubio.
She got it terribly wrong, didn't she?
Yeah, she did. But that's fine. People are allowed to get it wrong.
It's this idea that free speech was weaponised as a cause. I mean, you and I know the history of Weimar Germany well, and we also know the history of the rise of the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler. What people don't realise, in fact, we had good and sensible, overtly anyway, political commentators in this country saying, "Oh no, Nazis are from the left." You remember that dreadful thing that now the political editor at Daily Mail, Peter Van Onselen, came up.
We've covered that. Margaret Brennan, it wasn't her best day in the
wasn't her best day in the office. But what I did want to say is that when Hitler came to power, he and it's just a perfect foil for the PVO argument. He didn't nationalise industries. He engaged German industrialists to do that for him. He essentially privatised a lot of the Weimar Republic's plants. The building of the autobahns, etc. These were already set aside by the Republic, and what he did was shift the spend over into industrial Germany. So you can't really be socialist if you're actually privatising. Anyway. Well, we just want to move on to we've canvassed all of the stuff.
All of the European stuff. Yeah, that's all been covered.
And then we go to Israel and the Middle East. Of course, there were 3 buses exploded near Tel Aviv on Thursday, or Friday morning our time, in what Israeli police are calling a suspected coordinated terror attack. The buses where the bombs exploded were empty and in separate parking lots about 500 metres apart in the town or city of Bat Yam. No injuries from the explosions, but a pretty ugly sort of event all the same, Jack.
Yes. Yeah,
And
there was a suggestion. This is just gossip at this stage that perhaps the timers were set for AM, not PM, by mistake.
I mean, I don't want to make light of this, but that has confused us over the journey when we've perhaps daylight savings is our real Achilles heel. Look, that's possible, but at that event, obviously, thankfully, no injuries or any worse. But that incident coincided with the release of 4 deceased hostages. Jack, pretty grim scenes in Israel, and 4 more dead will be released next week.
And it turns out that the Israelis say that the 2 small children were indeed the Israelis, but the coffin that the Gazans said was their mother didn't in fact contain their mother. In fact, contained the remains were not remains of any of the Israeli hostages.
Oh, I see. Yeah, makes it even worse. Okay,
it does.
So
I noticed that the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia weighed in yesterday. What we saw today in Gaza is a disgrace to Islam, an act of blasphemy against Allah.
And that's in regard to the release of
and the ceremony involved with the handover.
Oh, okay. Well, Egypt will put the 36-hole golf course, Trump golf course, in Gaza on hold. Egypt is developing a plan to rebuild Gaza without forcing Palestinians out of the Strip. Jack.
Well, this is what you and I spoke about, was who was Trump talking to when he was talking about redeveloping Gaza? Was he talking to the rest of the Arab world? And I kind of suspected he was. And at least the Egyptians have got off the couch and said, well, we will be involved. We will do something about it. Obviously, it's a long way from any kind of plan, but it's a start.
Okay. COVID and the loss of faith in public health measures. There's big issues around this, Jack. I looked at some of these tweets that have come up here. We might remember, listeners, Deborah Birx, who was one of the bigwigs at the CDC, I think, or had been taken out of the CDC to run.
She's resigned. She's retired now. But
yeah, retired. But she was essentially working for the White House in their pandemic. We might remember Deborah Birx was the one who recoiled in horror when Donald Trump talked about getting bleach into the body or getting some ultraviolet light in there. She was the one there when Trump was giving these daily briefings. Was a terribly bad idea. Now she's come forward, and according to, I haven't had time to check this, but she's come forward that they said they wanted 2 weeks to flatten the curve, was just marketing for harsh months-long lockdowns. This comes from Kevin Bass, who is a medico himself. I did look enough medico himself. Who
I've actually watched the interview. Yeah, she said.
Yeah. Okay. Well, tell me more about it.
Well, essentially what she said was, we told them we only wanted 2 weeks to flatten the curve. That wasn't actually true at the time. What we were doing was buying the time so we could come up with some other numbers to get a further extension of it.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, how far do we go with this?
She has a book to sell. Even if that's true, I don't think telling the whole population that's necessarily a good plan. There's a lot of damage, I think, has been done to people's faith in public health officials, and almost all that damage has been done by the public health officials themselves.
Yeah. I think there's what's missing in that, Jack, is that when COVID arrived in 2020, and was making a mess of Europe, making a mess of the United States in New York and so forth. I think there was a grave fear from public health officials that it was going to be far more substantial than it ended up being. I think we've got 26 million deaths from COVID since the pandemic arose. Now, that's in pandemic terms pretty small beans. Now, we can say that part of it was down to vaccination, part of it was down to policy, but there may well have been overreaction and overreach. What I find, and look, I certainly get this because you're seeing it everywhere. I mean, Bobby Kennedy Jr. is the Secretary of Health in the United States. It's bizarre. They've got a measles outbreak over there at the moment, and almost all of those people who have suffered measles, almost all of them are children, almost all of them are unvaccinated. And in little Bobby Kennedy's website, what was it called? The Children's Health Defence, that website that he used to run. There was a piece there saying measles is actually pretty good for you. You need to get a few measles onto you. I mean, there's maybe the pandemic has contributed, or public health management has contributed to this kind of woo science stuff. But it is there will be a reckoning about all of this.
Yes, there will be. And like I say, we saw it in Australia, public health officials saying don't catch a football if you're in the crowd.
Yeah, there was nutty stuff. I take from that, there was a sense of panic. That there was a real sense of panic that the worst thing that could have happened is that you had a big outbreak and your public health system just collapsed. And then next thing you know, you've got tents out the front of your hospitals and they're morgues. And that did happen. It happened in New York. It happened in Italy. It happened in northern Italy. It happened in the UK. These things did happen. And that was the great fear.
Well, they did build the tent hospitals in New York and in the UK and didn't use them at all.
No, the New York ones were most certainly used, mate. They did have refrigerated trucks storing bodies because their morgues were full. So, there's talk now that Trump is going to essentially ban the COVID vaccinations. This is where this sort of stuff leads to, and I just don't see where this is all going to happen. You've got H5N1 outbreaks here as well. Hard to buy eggs in Australian supermarkets, but much harder in the United States due to an H5N1. And your old mate Joe Rogan says, "Oh, it's all bullshit. It's all deep state contrived nonsense." And you're probably right that some of the failures in pandemic management around COVID have contributed to an audience, to that sort of opinion.
I suspect that Bobby Kennedy Jr. wouldn't be the health secretary if there had not been the loss of faith in the public health officials.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. It's an interesting sort of speculator, but I don't know. I think Bobby Kennedy Jr. Ultimately, have you seen some of the stuff that he's come up with in terms of antidepressants, SSRIs?
Yep.
Where are we going to go with that? I mean, people are already talking about a mental health emergency in the United States. We're probably always not far from that ourselves here. You take away antidepressants from people, what do they expect is going to happen? And Kennedy, of course, will say, "Oh, well, this is why we have school shootings, because of antidepressants." Absolutely no basis for it. I mean, I tell you what we should do is we measure. I mean, I've said as a joke for a while that I think Bobby Kennedy will kill more people than Elon Musk, but you'll have to wait 4 or 5 generations to see that through. What we should do is make a little marker right now on life expectancy in the United States, male and female. Let's have a look at infant mortality, neonatal mortality, and and deaths up to the age of 5, and make a little marker and see how they are in 4 years' time.
Yeah.
All right. Thank God we're moving on to sport, Jack. It's
So the Champions Trophies come back into being after 8 years of not being.
oh God, it was all sorts of things beforehand. And look, there might have been a COVID issue that suspended it the first time around, but it is lovely to see Pakistan hosting.
Almost hosting everyone by the Indians.
Yeah, hosting everyone by the Indians. The Indians and the Pakistanis haven't spoken formally since 2008, so that was the compensation that they would have their big game. There'll be about 3.5 billion people watching that, and that will be played in Sharjah, I think.
In Dubai. In Dubai. And indeed, if India make the final will be in Dubai.
Is that right? That's a bit of a shame. But it's obviously a great matter. You know, I watched the first game, New Zealand v Pakistan, Pakistan v New Zealand, and just the immense pride that was felt by a lot of Pakistan cricketers from days of yore that they were hosting this. It's kind of a wonderful thing. New Zealand were very, very good. And I wonder too, now that Pakistan hosting, whether the weight of expectation might be too great. We saw Baba make, crikey, I got about 30, I think he got about 30 off about 80 balls. And they just really weren't in the hunt. And I just think they'd be going, I don't want to get out, I don't want to get out, I don't want to
yeah, look, I only watched a bit, but it did look a bit like that. And India have beaten Bangladesh, and Jack, I think I sent you a note saying that catch that Rohit Sharma dropped. I reckon I would have pouched that.
He looks a couple of hamburgers over his playing weight too, Rohit. And that was a hat-trick ball, by the way.
Yes, I know, and it was a soda.
She should be dirty of the bowler. I mean, he's the captain, so he can't say much. But gee,
well, the bowler was smiling, but I think there might have been a bit of grit in the teeth there.
Oh, mate, it could have caught in his hat. It just sort of bobbled off the inside edge. He didn't have to move. He had to move the hands just to the left of his body.
It didn't even go in and out. It just popped. It wasn't an in and out one. It just came straight off the hard hands.
Yeah, he punched the ground a few times. It wasn't good. Their fielding generally was awful. In fact, they had Bangladesh 5 for 35, and it looked like they were not going to knock them over for about 50. But there was a great little fight back there from. I watched him bat. I'll just have to think of his name. It's quite an unusual name. His name is Hridoy, I think. He made it 100 even, batting at 6. Got some support from the lower order. Really was a terrific knock. Made perhaps a little bit amusing by the fact that he was cramping in both legs for the last few overs, so he'd swing the bat at the ball coming in, often hit it away for a 4, but then just collapse on the ground. He couldn't run at all, so that was kind of amusing. But they fought back to make 228. It was never going to be enough. Shubman Gill. Back in form, I think one of India's best bats going around. Got 100, got 101. Sharma out for 41. Virat Kohli, the run of outs continues, but the favourites, India, had a comfortable win. Australia play England on the Saturday night, Jack.
They do. What about Sam Constance? I watched the footage of his short innings in the Shield game.
Yes. There was a lot of discussion about it. I mean, you'd have to say you can't build a Test career on that kind of batting. I mean, that was the view. I mean, he was lapping the great Victorian bowler,
Scott Boland.
Yeah, Scott Boland, lapping him, and then he ended up getting cleaned up by a ball that just pitched on leg. It didn't do a whole lot. He just missed it. It
jagged towards leg slightly, but he stepped across it and tried to put it over the fence. from the hooking from the off. But
He got 100 in a Marsh Cup game a couple of weeks back, and yeah, look, you'd have to ask a bit about the wicket. This was played at the SCG, wasn't it? I'm sure it was.
yeah, no, the wicket was fine.
Yeah,
and
because
both
there
the
were some
coaches
pretty
said-
low scores.
Yeah, but both the coaches thought the wicket was okay. If you're facing Scott Boland, stepping across the wicket and exposing your stumps is a high risk strategy in over number 2.
Yeah, it didn't make a lot of sense. A mate of mine in Hong Kong was watching as well, and he sent me some messages saying this kid can't be serious. Jackson Bird, Jack, played for Australia, of course. Journeyman around Australian cricket, took his 400th first-class wicket in the game against Victoria. He's played for Tasmania, New South Wales. I think he might have played for another state along the way, but I think he's only about the number. I think the 6th player to get to take 400 first-class wickets. There's a pretty illustrious group there. So well done to Jackson Bird.
He's always been a very good rather than a great cricketer, but he's stuck with it.
Look, he's swing. It's not easy being a swing bowler, Jack.
In
it's
Australia,
a little bit like being an off spinner in Australia, with the exception of Nathan Lyon and maybe Ashley Mallett. It's pretty hard going.
Mm.
You're going to get belted a few times. You're going to learn that way. Yes. So Sam Constant, I don't know what's going on there. So of course the Australians play in June. We'll play the South Africans. And on that performance, you'd have to say, he was a lock to be selected and open the batting in that game. And I'm not quite sure that the selectors will be viewing that. He's got a few more Shield games to prove himself. He kept his head down and make a few runs, compile an innings. But as it stands, I don't think you could have him in the Australian side.
No. On that, he doesn't get performs. I saw something from England about the racing crowds, because the racing crowds in Australia are not so good at the moment. And this was some of the clubs over there. What they're doing is, if you're an 18 to 24-year-old, you pay £100 and you get 12 race days at the club as a member, and you also get some reciprocal membership rates somewhere else. So this is a lot less than the normal membership, but they're actively going out and searching for the 18 to 24-year-olds. And there's a lesson in that for the Australian racing clubs, I think.
Yeah. I mean, they really do need to lift their game and look at the marketing stuff. Otherwise, they are going to have some problems. I mean, the sport is under constant attack by animal rights type groups, right or wrong. That's just the way it is. And if their numbers decline, then it'll end up like greyhound
They'll be
racing,
vulnerable.
where people are, and I think that vulnerability is always there. And the animal rights stuff, that's not going to go away. So they've got to deal with all those ethical issues, and then they've got to try and get people excited in racing and younger people excited in racing.
Yep.
And it's pretty tough because it's a nice old cluttered sports market around the country. Now, this sort of staggered me during. We've got the tennis player Sinner. He's been found to have. Taken a banned substance, and he negotiated a 3-month penalty, and normally it's a year.
Yeah, I saw an interview with Daniel Medvedev, the Russian tennis player, and his response was good. I hope that from now on everyone can talk to WADA, and if they tell you we found this, it's 2 years, you answer, no, I want a month. Actually, and I hope it's a precedent. It's going to be fine.
Well, Sinner, for what it's worth, claims that his physiotherapist had sprayed a steroid based treatment onto a cut in his skin, and that's why he tested positive. Yeah, it's one of the more. It's one of the more entertaining explanations, anyway, and it may well be true.
And
But
of course, his penalty is, I think he gets 2 or 3 months, whatever it is.
it's a holiday.
Yeah, it's a holiday, and noticeably, he's eligible to play again before Roland Garros, before the next Grand Slam.
Yeah, before all the Grand Slams. Yeah,
So he's just won in Melbourne. He volunteers to take a holiday, and he comes back in time for Roland Garros.
My understanding of the process was that this was handled internally, I suppose, by is it the ITF? And WADA said, "Hello, what's going on there?" And said, we'll sort this out. So WADA didn't actually get involved. And I'm not quite sure why that happened, but anyway, he's got a month when he could have got a year, so you can't really knock him.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know where we end up with all that sort of stuff, but that does take us out for the show for the day. That is
unless you've got Albo or Peter Dutton to come on next,
Peter, we give him a bit of a hard time, wouldn't we? What's wrong with you? What's wrong with your head? What is wrong with your head? It gets alopecia, and people, it gets does get a bit sensitive about it. So it's one of those no go areas in an interview, I presume.
I watched Bob Hawke do an interview in the very early days of Lawyers, Guns and Money, which was when it's still on Triple R. Filmed it, but recorded. They're doing a pre-record the day before Cup Day in their grotty little studios in Fitzroy. And I think I played a small role in getting them to get Bob Hawke there as the Prime Minister to go on their program.
I was going to say, it's not bad. It's not a bad get.
Yeah, and Ross and Dennis were all primed for this. They had some tough questions to ask the Prime Minister when he came in. So it's a terribly grotty little studio, very tiny. Hawkey sits down in between them, and Hawke's a bit of a toucher, so he's put his hand on Ross's shoulder.
Yes, yeah.
And then
at a personal level, Jack.
Yeah, and then on John, and then on Dennis's shoulder, and he pulls the form guide out of the packet and out of the back pocket, and Ross is a mad keen punter, and all of the hard questions just disappeared. They were. Hawkey was so charismatic. They were lapping it up. It was the softest interview you've ever seen in your life. It was very funny.
Well, we probably won't have Anthony Albanese or Peter Dutton on next week, unless they feel the need to soften their images by having me yell at them for a good hour. Then that might work out. They might get the pity vote, Jack.
Yeah, they'll save us for the Friday before polling day.
Yes, the big shifter. All right, well, that does take us out. We want to thank you once again for listening. We always enjoy your input, and please, you know how to get hold of us by now. But drop us a line, and with any questions you want to ask. These are fairly grim, uncertain times, and we'd love to assist you where we possibly can. And that takes us out for episode 103, sort of, kind of. And we look forward to talking with you next week. See ya.